Thanks, Ben. I've got a few questions that have come up and a couple of comments. One of the comments talks about claimant will need to prove that they caught COVID, and the question was how. And the statement was, "Stop worrying. We should stop worrying about the threat of litigation."
I'd say worrying about everything is a complete waste of time. Yeah, and spending all your time worrying is pointless. Don't worry about litigation, but just do something to reduce the risk of it. These aren't complicated things to do, really. I think the big learn is there are simple things that people should do, but there are some people who don't do the simple things, and that's where I'll be in 3 years' time.
Okay, and in terms of admission back to school, there's concerns about physical intervention, particularly in terms of those children who we might say look for that physical contact.
Yeah, I think there's no way to avoid this. We're back to balance of risks again. I mean, there are certain practical things people can do, and the face-to-face issue is the crucial one, and that'll need re-emphasizing in training and re-emphasizing in discussions among staff. It is fascinating, just watch on YouTube the number of interactions between police and members of the public when, as soon as they're thinking about something else, they completely forget about the safety and everyone goes face to face. And you'll still see that in schools, and I always do. The risk here has just elevated, but it's still about oblique angles. It's not complicated stuff. You can the focal point of the body for guiding is the elbow. And if you guide an elbow forwards, that guides shoulders, which moves heads. So it's relevant to spitting too. Guiding people in that way to turn them away is one thing you can do. But I think inevitably, people are going to end up having to hold. Then it's back to the hygiene. It's interesting with the only measure there seems to be of risk really is related to hand washing. And it's just the number of times people wash their hands. It's someone who washes their hands 6 times a day is significantly less likely to get COVID than someone who washes them 5 times. It's that different. And it was also interesting with frontline workers in the health service that when the only study that's looked at the relative risks found that people who worked for the health service but didn't have any contact with patients, these are people working in offices, were slightly more likely to get it than people who are on the front line. And it might be just that all of us have a level of risk, and those on the front line need to just be washing and doing the basics like that. That's the best protection we can offer, really. I know that in practice settings that I've had contact with, where people have been working all the way through, they will say quite freely that there are times when they're having to go closer than 2 meters. And if that's the reality, we have to put that again in our risk assessment and explain why it's necessary. And it's necessary when the risk of doing something else is higher.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ben. Just one that's just popped through now. Has anybody already got a specific COVID-19 health declaration, and would they be happy to share it? And I think if you put on your chat now, if you are happy to share one, I think William Henry Smith have one, and then Sarah Hillen, we will get that information shared with you. So a couple more questions, Ben. How often do we have to update our risk assessments in line with government legislation?
There's no set time. I'd say that it's really when circumstances change, then you have to update it. So normally, in my world, after there's been an incident where something's gone wrong, people always update on that day. But generally, within most policies and risk assessments, the time scale is annually is good practice. Your best practice is more frequently than that, but annually is reasonable. Okay. It's back to what would the majority, what do most people do? You're back onto that safety in numbers.
One leader said, staff are not acting in their usual manner. They're quite anxious, and it's causing pupils to become anxious, and they feel this is quite unpredictable. How do we record risk when we are not sure of the intensity of it?
You can't record risk that you haven't assessed. You're absolutely right. When people are anxious, humans, when they're anxious, firstly, they become more tribal. They're more likely to form gangs, and they're more critical of other people. So they're keen to point out other people's mistakes. They're also they don't want to think. They really don't want to think. And you can see that in schools, I think, sometimes when people are demanding, they just want more and more detailed guidance to be given to them for every possible eventuality. And I think what we need to do is, firstly, talk about how we all feel and behave when we're stressed, and tell people it's okay to do that, but get people to understand what's actually happening, why we're all behaving a bit differently. And I think we've got to have these conversations with children too, and explain how people behave when we're under pressure. And there's no, I think, there's nothing we can do to stop people behaving like this. But what we can do is we have to set the lead as leaders and not fall into the trap ourselves. So however uncertain we're feeling, you've got to pretend, haven't you? You've got to pretend and act as if you're not flustered, even when you are. And again, have this conversation. So the staff need to say, you know, the kids are going to pick up their emotions from you. Your job is, no matter how ropey you're feeling, act confident, act with good humor, act as if the message you want to give is it's going to be okay, everything's okay. And then you're actually going to reduce the risk. You're going to reduce the risk of having problems with the youngsters if you can get that firm signal over.
Okay, I think that's all the questions, Sharon. And just to say that the recordings of the chat will be available via Engage website.
Another question that's just come through. Maybe Bern, if you could advise with this one. Sorry, Sue. Just there's the one from Brendan. Is there someone or somewhere to send risk assessments to for independent external approval or agreement? Some kind of best practice?
No. Well, no, not really. I think what I do is share it with colleagues. As I say, I think we should. There's no shortage of people who want to set themselves up as experts, and they'll happily, you know, charge for consultancy to do that sort of thing. But the expertise, there are no experts. As you opened this, you said this at the beginning. This hasn't happened before, so they're all bluffing. What we're doing together is exploring what's the best way forward, and it's the thinking process. It's got to be. The last chair of the Health and Safety Executive, Judith Hackett, was very good on this. And when she was being asked at a conference about the best sort of risk assessment, and someone was suggesting that they should be complicated documents with all sorts of quantitative numbers and graphs, and she said she thought that was dangerous because it distanced leaders from what was really happening. She said she'd prefer to calculate risk in a different way. And she said, what I would ask is, would I be happy for someone I care about to take that sort of risk? And I've always said, where children are concerned, when you don't know what to do, if that was your child and someone else was in your position, what would you want that other person to do? And if that's the basis of our risk assessment, I don't think you'll go far wrong. It's important that it's someone else. What would you want someone else to do? It's not about how we behave with our own children is different. I used to get in bed with my son and read him stories and fall to sleep. I wouldn't do that at work. But with someone else, often when people are saying, tell us what to do, if they just stopped for a moment and thought, if that was my child, what would I want someone to do? Life becomes much clearer then.
Thank you, Bern. I know that Neil Topless, one of our members of the Engaged Committee, has had experience of working with unions. Neil, would you mind unmuting, please, and just sharing a little bit about that experience? And while you're talking us through that, Neil, if anybody else has any other questions for Bern or for each other, any comments or any practice that you'd like to share, any suggestions, then please pop it into the chat and then we'll call you forward so you can share what it is that you're doing. Neil, so you've had experience around reviewing. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
I can do. If you were going to put me on the spot, I probably wouldn't have put the message on, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know if my experience is the same as anybody else's. So we've got, I work for Sandwell Local Authority, which is quite unionised. And certainly all the other special schools within the borough have felt under increasing amounts of pressure, particularly from the NEU and GMB, but with regards to very active members, almost sending a daily barrage of emails to the schools requesting information and policy documentation. My understanding is that the local authority as a whole has been working closely with the unions to try and sort of develop a strategy, if you like, to secure schools opening. But the unions have effectively tried to stand in the way of that to some extent by suggesting that the science and the medical advice isn't good enough and their members are at risk. Now, you know, as a result of, I suppose, what Bern said a little bit earlier with the flexibilities that are offered to us with regards to the government, you know, the schools are opening at different paces and at different levels, really. And I think what's been useful is from the local authority, although they are highly unionised, want their schools open. So what they've been able to do is actually stand by schools and say, look, you know, these decisions are local, they are for you, they're your own risk assessments, you're the only people who know what your school is able to provide, what your school environment's like, your sizes of your rooms, the numbers of kids, the types of kids, and so we'll trust you to make those judgments. And if there are issues with unions, then they're happy to sort of support us with those. So you know, it's quite tense at times, and I think our school's probably not under the cosh that some of the other schools have been in, and that's largely dependent on the activity levels of their particular staff members. I don't know if anybody else has got anything to add to that or wants to share anything regarding that from any of your own union experiences.
Thank you, Neil. Whilst everybody's sort of taking that in, Bern, do you have any response to Neil on that he's just shared at all?
Yeah, well, I've read a lot of the comments, and the comments when people have been anxious about opening schools have been exclusively comments on the risk of opening the school, and what they haven't acknowledged is the risk of not opening, which for a competent risk assessment you've got to weigh up both. And I think what we need to do is quantify some of those risks in the way that by referring to the international situation too. But as I said, damage is already being done. There is no zero tolerance. There's no zero risk option here. And I think people are mistaking that. I think people are getting very anxious now talking about risk without remembering that there was always risk. Every day when you go out, there's risk. That's what it is. Life is risk.
Thank you, Bern. So there's another question that's just come through, Bern and colleagues who may well be able to support with. I think it's important to share risk assessments with the community for comment by all staff. How might you suggest we consult with parents and pupils? And Bern, but also we have so many experts who are doing this. So if you have examples of what you're doing, that would be great. And if you could share that, well, I just popped to open my door, hence the doorbell going. Yeah,
definitely must consult with staff and all stakeholders. That's in the guidance. I did a book on risk assessment a few years ago now, but that's almost a big section of that is just quotes from the Health and Safety Executive and from their website. And it's useful when you're being challenged to put quotes from the Health and Safety Executive because people pay attention to that. So there are good quotes from the Health and Safety Executive about the fact that health and safety is not about stopping people doing things. It's about helping people who decide what they want to do it as safely as possible. So it's not about putting obstacles up to what we're trying to do. We're trying to look after these children and make provision for them. Having decided to do that, health and safety is about assessing the risks and doing it as carefully as we can. And it's sometimes helpful just to take the quotes out and put those directly into your policies. So you make a statement about what your risk assessment is, what your conclusion is. You put a quote from the HSE that says exactly the same thing. and then you share it with everyone. So definitely share it with the staff, share it with parents. These are open documents.
Thanks, Bernard. Neil, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, it was only briefly, just to sort of share what we're doing at the moment with regards to sharing information with parents. I mean, I should imagine most of you are giving all those families and children a call weekly, probably, that aren't in your schools. And during those conversations, we are essentially trying to gauge the levels of risk that those kids are facing. So we have sort of almost like a priority list of those kids that are in school. But we're quite aware that the circumstances for those individual kids are going to be changing over time. You know, it's not like the school holidays where you can go out and play all day. You know, the kids are literally sort of, you know, sitting in 4 bare walls, some of them. So, you know, we're quite sensitive to being aware of the changing risks and circumstances of some of those kids. The challenge we've got, of course, is we've only got so much space available, and how do we sort of share that space amongst those kids that need it. But I think the only other thing I'd add in terms of that risk is there's difference in the consultation versus contribution. So I'm more than happy that, you know, once we've completed our risk assessments, they go on our website, and anybody who wants to have a look at it can have a look and have a say or whatever. But, you know, in terms of anything sort of more detailed with parents and carers, just literally or the reality of the time that's going to take and their understanding of it is going to be quite a challenge, I think. So I think what we've done is we've just got a point of reference, if you like, say, look, if you want to see it, here it is. You know, you're more than welcome to have a view.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to make an unashamed plug here, and that unashamed plug is that for a cost of a day's supply, you can join Engage in Their Future. And Byrne talked about sharing ideas and being able to talk within a cluster of like-minded heads. It's what we do all the time. All the feedback we get from our national conference is about the positivity of being able to talk with like-minded people. And in a crisis like this, where you're trying to produce risk assessments, if you want to check them against somebody, it's good to check them against a similar organisation and a similar school. And therefore, I'll say it again, for the cost of a day's supply, you can join our organisation and have access to people around you. We're split up into regions. We have a national conference every year, and on top of that, there's national competitions for young people, awards for young people, and it's a great place to be and to socialise with like-minded people. End of plug.
And Richard, I think Tony Bailey would like just to mention something. Tony, are you still online?
I'm here. Hello.
Oh,
I think what Byrne said in terms of there being no experts and this being a really new field for everybody is bang on, really. No one really knows what the right answer is at the moment because we've not had to go through this. And I think the way that I work in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and the way we've approached it there is that we've come across and we've decided to do and agree a set format for risk assessments and for health and safety advice across all special schools so that everyone can help each other and do it all in the same way. And I think there's a strength in community if you use the same standard in that way, especially in situations that are so unique as in this one. And questions like PPE and the risks associated to that, we've approached that based on a tasks, what PPE is required for each task rather than the venue. And we've created a list of the tasks that we think special schools will need to do. And then we've given that list to our health colleagues. And then they've come back and said, this needs PPE, this doesn't need PPE. And we've also then asked what level of PPE is required for each of those tasks. And then so we get an informed decision based on areas that we're really not experts in. And we need experts to give that way. So the only thing that I would add to that is the most important thing has been approaching this as a community. And because as we go into this new phase, this unknown phase of schools starting to reopen and come back, again, we've approached that based on a community base where some children might be able to go to other schools if they have similar risk assessments in play. But the key there will be about recording the additional mitigation that can happen in each of the schools where the children go to. And risk assessments is all about recording mitigation, isn't it? and removing as much of the risk as possible. It's impossible to remove it all, but to be recording that is key. I think I'm sure that Bern would have said that. So I wasn't here at the beginning. Bern, you want to comment on that?
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And I think also, it's not all bad news, this. I mean, in all sorts of industries, everybody is saying we won't be going back to how we were doing things before. Just, I mean, the fact that we're doing these meetings, and I've spoken to a number of quite big businesses who are saying now that firstly, the investment in the IT stuff means that they're never going to do these meetings again. And a lot of them are looking at the cost of real estate in London and thinking, why the hell are we keeping these offices? So there's all sorts of changes that could happen. For us, given the disapplications that have come in because of the emergency, we ought to look at this as an opportunity to push forward, to do things that we know were going to be things that we ought to be doing, because it might be we can do them more quickly now. For a start, the disapplication applies to the curriculum too. At the moment, we can review the curriculum, and I would be doing risk assessments to drive the curriculum. What is it that we need to change in the curriculum to reduce the risk of psychological and emotional harm to these children and to staff? Because part of what you have to do to comply with your health and safety responsibilities towards the workers is to have measures in place to protect the emotional welfare of the staff too. That's going to be an issue as we go forward. And I can see real opportunities for imaginative people to explore different ways of working here, show they work, justify them through risk assessment. And I think it'll be very difficult for people to come and try and push us back into what we were doing 2 years ago. So there's an opportunity for us to really move forward at a pace here and come out of this a lot better than we were when we went into it.
And I just have something just to add. Obviously, I think a lot of the people that have gone on today are from mainstream schools, and I think it's important to, for specials, that puts us in one category, and we can deal with it all at once, in fact. But do we need to class all our children within any schools as vulnerable? These are children that have been through lots of different extremities in terms of loss. And my worry is that we don't assume that in special schools we do one risk assessment, but in mainstreams we are just looking at our previously vulnerable children, because actually those children that have not been with us for potentially 6 months will have significant anxiety.
I think this applies to all children.
No, just in terms of risk assessment.
Yeah, what I don't want to do is scare people into the idea that there's a load of paperwork to be done here. So it isn't that we've got to suddenly produce mounds of paperwork risk assessments. I wouldn't want to go down that route. But I think everybody should be taking an overall look at what we're doing with a different lens, which is the reality that the psychological and emotional state that all children are in at the moment isn't quite the same as it was perhaps this time last year, and it may not be for the next year. So part of what we're doing is always, that is a risk assessment, but a risk assessment, in court, I very often praise short risk assessments as being accessible, suitable for purpose, and tear apart long ones. And actually, I mean, the reason I get most of my work is I write very short expert reports, and people think that's odd, but it's sometimes harder to write a short report than a long one, but it's a good discipline to get into. So I think quick records of risk assessments, but focus on the thought process, and the thought process is being imaginative in enabling the youngsters to thrive in a new world here. And I think that's an optimistic way of looking at it.
Thank you, Bern. And any other questions before we draw to a close this afternoon that you'd like to share with each other, or whilst we've got Bern in the space, as it were? If not, then we just want to say a huge thank you, Bern. I think what you facilitate is that emotional containment, which allows us to sit and take a moment to breathe, and therefore be able to be steady ourselves and think into how we can best support our staff teams, our whole school communities, because we know that we're all going to need to be as steady as we possibly can if we are to meet potentially our unsteady children and families as they come back into us. And you spoke about the curriculum, which you know we are all incredibly passionate about. And that leads me just very quickly, before I hand back to Rich and Sue, our co-chairs, into the session on Wednesday, where we have Professor Barry Carpenter talking about his recovery curriculum, which is exactly that Bern has said, and really the underpinning element about the social, emotional, mental health and wealth of our youngsters and our staff teams. And alongside Barry speaking, we'll be sharing some resources and ways in which the Embark Trust in Derby, a trust of 14 schools from EYFS through to secondary, with 2 special schools as well, one supporting children experiencing social, emotional, mental health, another special school for children who have profound learning disabilities. And so lots and lots of activities, resources, teaching resources, which if you are around to join us on Wednesday afternoon, you're more than welcome, and you can then have access to those resources, which may well reduce additional workload for your staff teams, which is the intention. So no further ado, Bern, as always, it's incredible to speak with you, to have you here with us as part of our National Association. Back to Rich and Sue to close. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Sharon. Great intro, great closure there. Again, my appreciation to Bern. There's loads and loads of resources flying around by being part of EITF at the moment. Sharon's doing some great work in different organisations as well, which is also being shared on YouTube. And some of the stuff that came out working with Tristan Williams, another engaged member this week, is about looking after your staff, making sure that all this process that we've talked about today is providing us with the ability to make our schools run effectively and well, and therefore that's looking after our staff, because what we don't want to be doing is having a staffing crisis later in the year as the anxiety kicks in for everyone else. So personal well-being for yourselves, personal well-being for your staff, that helps create happy cultures within schools, which supports our young people. Again, plug for Wednesday, 1:30. There's a separate link for that. If you want that, go to Georgina as you applied to get on today. We will post a recording of this, and if Bern's got any resources to share, he can send those through to Georgina, and we'll put those up as well. Anything else from anybody? Sue, do you want to say anything?
No, I was going to say about the resources. There's several colleagues have asked for resources, so we'll try and get our website filled with those from schools.
Okay, which leads me to say thank you for joining us today. We had 64 people here at one point, which is great for us. I think there's going to be more than that on Wednesday, so sign in early. Thank you to everybody for coming, and be safe, be careful. And I think June the 1st, somebody come to June the 1st will be a day in history as our schools reopened. Go well, be safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.